In the first week of July 2026, in the hours before dawn, the war over Crimea entered a phase that Russian air defense crews on the peninsula had been dreading since the previous summer. Ukraine's security service, its military intelligence directorate, HUR, and the newly formed unmanned systems forces under Robert Magyar Brovdi had spent months proving a single idea: that a peninsula defended by some of the densest air defense coverage in the Russian arsenal could still be made to bleed if the attacking side stopped trying to punch through the shield, and instead found ways to make the shield fail on its own terms. What follows is a reconstruction, built from confirmed Ukrainian and independent reporting, of how that idea played out across Hvardiiske, Saky, and Belbek air bases, and across the power grid that keeps the whole peninsula running in the days leading up to and including July 5th, 2026. Some of the texture, the exact sequence of a single drone's flight, the precise words in a control room, cannot be verified, and should be read as plausible reconstruction rather than confirmed fact. The strikes themselves, the targets hit, and the broad shape of the campaign are drawn directly from statements by Ukraine's general staff, the SBU, HUR, an independent satellite, and open source confirmation. The campaign did not begin with Hvardiiske. It began weeks earlier with a pattern that Ukrainian planners had refined strike by strike. Hit the power grid first, force the peninsula's defenders onto backup systems and split attention, then send follow-on waves at the military targets that backup power and stretched crews were least equipped to protect. By late June, Brovdi's unmanned systems forces had struck 37 energy facilities across occupied southern Ukraine in a matter of days. Transformers and substations in Crimea, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia, each one a small cut, none individually decisive, all of them compounding. On June 24th, the SBU and Special Operations Forces reported hits on Russian air defense hardware near the Kerch Strait. Two components of an S-400 system and two Pantsir S-1 units struck in the same operation that damaged 4 aircraft storage hangars at Saky. It was, in effect, a rehearsal for what came next, a demonstration that the integrated air defense network ringing the peninsula could be made to fight in more than one place at once, and that every missile spent on a decoy or a secondary target was a missile not available when the real strike arrived. By the last days of June, the pattern had become visible enough that Russian commanders on the peninsula would have recognized it even without hindsight. On the night of June 25th into June 26th, drones operated by HUR's Unmanned Systems Department struck Belbek Air Base near Sevastopol, a facility that has hosted a Russian fighter regiment since the occupation began in 2014, and has been targeted repeatedly since. Thermal footage released afterward and shared without dispute by open-source analysts who track the war closely showed a drone diving directly onto a MiG-29 as it sat on the ground, and a second impact against a nearby launch and refueling vehicle. Ukrainian officials estimated the damage from the strike, the aircraft, and the ground support unit destroyed alongside it, in the tens of millions of dollars. It was a small strike in terms of the number of drones involved, but it was precise, and it signaled something Russian planners could not ignore: that Ukraine's long-range strike units were now willing and able to put single, high-value airframes at risk with pinpoint accuracy rather than relying purely on saturation. Saky came next, and it came twice in the same week. On the night of July 1st, SBU drones struck aircraft hangars at the Saky military airbase. 5 confirmed hits on structures housing Russian fighter jets, with at least 2 of the hangars known to contain Su-30 and Su-30SM airframes at the moment of impact. A fire broke out in the hangar housing the Su-30SM, visible confirmation that the strike had found something worth burning. 2 days later, on July 3rd, the same base was hit again, this time with 7 hangars struck in total, housing a mix of Su-30SM, Su-30, and Su-24 aircraft, frontline bombers and fighters that Russia had been using to fly missile and bomb strikes into southern Ukraine. The SBU described it as the second strike on Saky within a week, a detail that mattered less for the individual damage than for what it told Russian commanders about their own vulnerability, that a base could be hit, repaired, or reinforced, and hit again before its defenses had meaningfully improved. It was in this atmosphere, with Saky smoking for the second time in 7 days, and Belbek still counting the cost of a destroyed MiG-29, that the operation against Hvardiiske began to take shape. Hvardiiske sits close to Simferopol, the administrative capital Russia has imposed on occupied Crimea, and Ukraine's general staff has been direct about why the base matters. It hosts operational tactical and naval aviation units. It supports combat sorties over the Black Sea and southern Ukraine. And critically, it has served as a storage and preparation site for the Shahed attack drones that Russia has used for years to batter Ukrainian cities. A base like this is not a single building or a single runway. It is a system: hangars for aircraft, storage bunkers for munitions and drones, fuel farms, maintenance shops, air defense emplacements arrayed around the perimeter to protect all of it, and a command structure trying to hold the whole system together under pressure it was never designed to absorb. The overnight operation that struck Hvardiiske on July 5th did not arrive in isolation. It arrived as part of what Ukrainian officials and independent trackers described as Kyiv's most ambitious single night of strikes against the Crimean power grid since the war began, a wave large enough that some estimates placed the number of kamikaze drones involved at between 400 and 600. The primary energy target was a major substation near the village of Strohanivka, feeding electricity to Simferopol and the surrounding region, a facility Ukrainian drones had already struck once, on June 25th, and returned to finish. Russian social media accounts and Ukrainian reporting both confirmed at least 4 impacts on the 330 kilovolt station, with fires still burning there by midday. The effect on the peninsula was total in the most literal sense, a complete loss of electricity service across all of occupied Crimea, an area with a population of roughly 2.5 million people, an outcome so severe that even Russia's own Kremlin-appointed officials had to acknowledge it. Mikhail Razvozhayev, the head of Sevastopol installed by Moscow, described what had happened using the euphemism Russian officials favor for admitting to a Ukrainian strike, technological disruptions caused by external influences, and confirmed that at least one city resident had been killed as a result of the network failures. He promised the lights would return soon across all districts. The blackout did not stay contained to Crimea. Roughly 3 to 3.5 million additional electricity users in the Russian-occupied portions of Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Donetsk suffered partial outages from the same wave of strikes. Against this backdrop, with the peninsula's grid failing, its bases already twice bloodied that week, and its air defense network having already been forced to spend interceptors on decoys and secondary targets during the June 24th operation near Kerch, the strike on Hvardiiske went in. Ukrainian and Russian military bloggers both reported that the attacking drones targeted air defense systems positioned around the airfield in addition to the aircraft and storage facilities inside it, a detail consistent with the tactic Ukrainian planners have used repeatedly, sending drones specifically to occupy or destroy the air defense assets meant to protect a target before or during the strike on the target itself, rather than treating the defenses as an obstacle to route around. 2 hangars storing Shahed attack drones and aviation equipment were confirmed hit, according to statements from Ukraine's General Staff and the SBU. Launch ramps and aircraft storage areas used to prepare and fly the Shahed drones that Russia has sent against Ukrainian cities for years were reported destroyed or damaged, along with additional air defense equipment on the base itself. Midday satellite imagery, the kind of independent confirmation that has become a routine check on claims from both sides in this war, showed 2 separate fires burning inside the airfield perimeter, and NASA's FIRMS fire detection system, which tracks heat signatures from orbit, recorded a large fire burning at coordinates inside the base, an anonymous confirmation from space that something inside Hvardiiske had been set alight regardless of what either government chose to say about it publicly. To understand why a base defended by radar, by Panzer S-1 short-range systems, by longer-range coverage extending across the peninsula, and by ordinary infantry weapons on the perimeter kept failing to stop these drones, it helps to understand what Ukraine has been building and refining specifically to survive that kind of defense. The backbone of the long-range strike fleet Ukraine has used against Crimea is built around cheap composite and plywood airframes, inexpensive enough that losing several of them to intercept a single high-value target is an acceptable trade, and simple enough in construction that they can be produced quickly and in volume. These are not stealth aircraft. In the way a fighter jet's radar cross-section is minimized through shaping and materials, they are small, slow by military aviation standards, and they fly low, often only a few hundred feet above open water or terrain, specifically to exploit 2 physical limitations that no amount of radar sophistication can fully overcome: the curvature of the Earth, which hides a low-flying target from a ground-based radar until it closes to a much shorter range than the radar's theoretical maximum, and sea or ground clutter, the chaotic mess of radar returns, bouncing off waves or terrain that makes a small, slow target difficult to distinguish from background noise until it is quite close. Layered onto that physical advantage is a navigation problem that Russia has spent enormous effort trying to solve and has never fully solved. Russian forces in Crimea operate systems like Pol 21, a ground-based electronic warfare network designed to jam and spoof satellite navigation signals, GPS, GLONASS, and other GNSS constellations, feeding false position data to any receiver trying to use them. Against an older generation of drones, dependent purely on satellite navigation, this kind of spoofing could be devastating, quietly walking a drone off its intended course until it either missed its target entirely or flew into a part of the sky its operators never intended it to enter. The drones Ukraine has been sending against Crimea in 2026 are built to survive exactly that scenario. They carry inertial navigation systems, self-contained instruments that track heading, speed, and elapsed time to calculate position without any outside signal at all. The same basic principle that guided aircraft and missiles long before satellite navigation existed. An inertial system drifts over time. Its position estimate grows less precise the longer it flies without a correction, but over the relatively short distances involved in a strike on Crimea, that drift is manageable. And when the drones detect that satellite signals have been compromised or spoofed, many switch into an autonomous mode, using onboard processing to hold a course toward preset target coordinates and to make final approach corrections without needing a live link back to a human operator at all. This is why simply jamming the control signal or spoofing the navigation feed, both of which Russian forces attempted repeatedly during the Hvardiiske operation and in the broader campaign, stopped being sufficient on its own. By the time a drone reached the inner defensive ring around a base like Hvardiiske, it was frequently no longer listening to anything Russian electronic warfare units were broadcasting. None of this made the drones invulnerable, and Russian air defense crews did shoot a number of them down, both during this operation and across the broader campaign of which it was a part. Panzer S-1 systems, a combined missile and rapid-fire cannon platform built specifically to handle exactly this kind of low, small, fast-approaching target, remain a serious threat at short range. And the same class of system was among the assets Ukraine specifically targeted near Kerch in the June 24th strike, precisely because Ukrainian planners understood how much damage a functioning Panzer battery could do to an incoming drone formation if left untouched. Longer-range systems like the S-400 and S-350 add radar coverage and missile reach further out, though both were designed primarily to counter aircraft and cruise missiles, flying at altitudes and speeds very different from a drone skimming the wavetops, which is part of why intercepting this kind of target consistently proves harder in practice than the platform's paper specifications would suggest. Russia has also claimed significant success in these engagements. Following the July 5th wave of strikes, Russian authorities claim to have shot down 519 drones across the broader attack, a figure that, if accurate, underscores just how large the total attacking force was that night, and a reminder that even a heavily saturated, partially successful defense can still remove the majority of individual airframes from an attacking formation. The strategic question was never whether every drone would get through. It was whether enough of them would get through at the right targets to make the base and the network protecting it unsustainable to defend indefinitely. That is the calculation Ukrainian officials have been explicit about. The SBU has stated plainly that its intention is to turn Crimea into what one official statement called a zone of constant losses for Russian forces. Not a single decisive knockout blow, but a sustained campaign designed to make every asset on the peninsula, every airfield, every substation, every bridge, every fuel depot, permanently vulnerable and permanently expensive to defend. Ukraine's general staff, in its statement following the July 5th strikes, described Hvardiiske and Saky as being among the key bases of Russian occupation forces in Crimea, used regularly to launch missile and bomb strikes against Ukraine and to support Russian military operations along the southern front, language chosen deliberately to frame these as legitimate military targets, rather than incidental damage. The same overnight operation extended well beyond the airfields. Ukraine's general staff reported strikes on 2 road bridges used for military logistics, one over the Hvardiiske-Yalanchik River near Huselnikove, and another over the Kalmius River near Staromarivka, both in temporarily occupied Donetsk region, crossings Russian forces have relied on to move personnel, weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. Ammunition depots in occupied areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson were also targeted in the same overnight window. Further afield, Ukrainian drones struck deep into Russia itself that same period, hitting an oil refinery in Yaroslavl, roughly 700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, and the Ust-Luga oil loading terminal and adjacent Vysotsk seaport near St. Petersburg, roughly 900 kilometers away, both sites that had already been struck repeatedly earlier in the year. Ust-Luga alone hit 5 times in a single 10-day stretch back in March. None of these targets sit inside Crimea, but all of them serve the same underlying purpose in Ukrainian strategy: to make every part of the system that supports Russia's war effort, fuel, logistics, air power, and electricity alike, simultaneously vulnerable so that no single sector of Russian defense planning can be reinforced without weakening another. The scale of the energy campaign specifically deserves attention on its own, because it is arguably the piece of this operation with the clearest, most measurable civilian and military overlap. Pravdi's unmanned systems forces reported disabling 16 energy facilities in occupied territories over a 48-hour span in early July, following an earlier 48-hour operation on July 1st and July 2nd, in which 12 power substations and 1 gas distribution station were struck. Across the broader window from July 1st to July 5th, Pravdi's units reported hitting 37 energy facilities across occupied southern Ukraine, targeting transformers and substations feeding Crimea, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. Satellite imagery comparing nighttime light levels across the peninsula between early July 2026 and the same period a year earlier showed a marked, visible drop in illumination, an unusually direct piece of independent evidence that the campaign was working as intended. Ukraine's official position, echoed by independent commentary on the war, treats electricity infrastructure in occupied territory as a legitimate dual-use military target precisely because it powers radar installations, command posts, repair facilities, water pumping stations that supply military bases, and the backup systems that bases fall back on when their primary power is cut, in addition to civilian homes. That framing draws a deliberate contrast with Russia's own strike campaign against Ukraine's civilian power grid and residential buildings, which Ukrainian officials and many outside observers describe as targeting infrastructure with no comparable military justification. What actually happened on the ground and in the air over Hvardiiske itself during the strike, at the level of individual drones, individual radar operators, individual missile launches, is where confirmed reporting runs out and reconstruction has to take over. And it is worth being honest about that boundary rather than presenting invented tactical detail as documented fact. What can be said with confidence is the shape of the outcome, not the frame-by-frame sequence that produced it. 2 hangars storing Shahed drones and aviation equipment were hit, launch ramps and additional storage were reported destroyed. Air defense equipment on the base was targeted as part of the same operation. Fires were confirmed burning by satellite imagery at midday, independent of anything either government said. Beyond that, the specific behavior of any individual radar operator that night, the exact number of interceptor missiles fired, whether a Panzer crew ever switched from missiles to its cannons in a close engagement, or whether any single drone was expended deliberately against an air defense position rather than an aircraft or hangar, has not been confirmed in open reporting and should not be treated as established fact. It is, however, consistent with tactics Ukraine has used and described in other operations, using part of an attacking formation specifically to suppress or destroy the point defenses protecting a target so that the remainder of the formation has a clearer path to the objective that matters most. What is possible to say with more confidence is why this particular combination of tactics, spoofing resistant navigation, low-altitude approach, exploiting radar horizon limits, cheap airframes flown in numbers large enough to absorb losses, and coordinated pressure on the power grid and air defense assets simultaneously has produced results Russian commanders in Crimea have struggled to prevent. A modern integrated air defense network is built around the assumption that its component parts, long-range radar, medium-range missile batteries, short-range point defense systems like Pantsir, and electronic warfare assets like Pol-21 will reinforce each other, each covering the gaps in the other's capability. That architecture depends on radar operators having enough time and enough clarity to correctly identify what they are looking at, on fire control channels being available when a real threat appears rather than tied up chasing decoys, and on command structures being able to prioritize the most dangerous target among many simultaneous ones. Every element of the Ukrainian campaign against Crimea in 2026, the split attacking formations, the low-altitude routing, the drones sent specifically against defensive assets rather than only against the primary target, and the parallel strikes against the power grid that supplies the whole defensive network is aimed at degrading exactly that coordination rather than trying to overpower any single layer of it directly. Russian officials have continued to claim substantial numbers of intercepted drones at nearly every reported strike, and those claims are likely at least partially accurate given the scale of the attacking waves involved. But the recurring pattern across Belbek, Saky, and Hvardiiske, repeated strikes on the same handful of bases within the same 1 or 2 week window, each one finding something new to burn, indicates that whatever fraction of each wave Russian defenses are stopping, it has not been enough to make these bases safe, and it has not been enough to let Russian commanders stop treating every night as a night when the next wave might arrive. The strategic consequences of that reality extend well beyond the value of any single MiG-29 or any single hangar of Su-30s. A forward airbase that can be reliably struck, and struck again within days if not fully repaired and reinforced, stops functioning as a secure rear area asset and starts functioning as a persistent liability, one that ties down air defense units, maintenance crews, and command attention that Russia would otherwise be free to allocate elsewhere along a very long front. Aircraft that might otherwise be based forward in Crimea, closer to the southern Ukrainian front and to Black Sea operations, become candidates for dispersal to bases further from Ukrainian reach, at the cost of longer flight times and reduced sortie rates. Shod drone stockpiles and preparation facilities that get destroyed have to be rebuilt or relocated, disrupting the tempo of Russia's own long-range strike campaign against Ukrainian cities in the near term. And an occupying power that cannot reliably keep the lights on across an entire peninsula, in a way its own regional officials are forced to publicly acknowledge, faces a slower but real erosion of the basic administrative confidence it needs to present Crimea as a stable, secured part of Russian territory rather than contested ground under continuous attrition. None of this means the war over Crimea or the broader war in Ukraine is approaching some singular turning point because of one night of strikes against one airfield. Russia retains substantial air defense capability on the peninsula, has repaired damaged infrastructure before and will likely do so again, and continues to claim it is intercepting the large majority of drones sent against it in any given wave. Claims that, again, are plausible given the scale of these attacks, even if the precise numbers are difficult to independently verify. What the pattern across Belbek, Saky, and Hvardiiske in the final days of June and the first days of July 2026 does show, based on confirmed statements from Ukraine's general staff, the SBU, HUR, and independent satellite and open source confirmation, is a sustained, deliberate campaign with a clear underlying logic to make Crimea expensive and unstable to hold from the air, one strike at a time, whether or not any single strike on its own looks decisive when it happens. Ukraine's own stated goal, in the words used by the SBU after the operation, is to keep the peninsula a zone of constant losses for as long as the occupation continues, and the events of that first week of July verified where verification exists, and treated as plausible reconstruction where it does not, are consistent with a campaign built to do exactly that, methodically, repeatedly, and without any obvious endpoint built into it yet. It is worth stepping back to look at the individual pieces one more time, because the value of this campaign lies less in any single strike, and more in how each strike closes off a response Russian commanders might otherwise have had available. Consider the sequence again in order. On June 24th, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces and the SBU hit Russian air defense components near Kerch, an S-400 element, and 2 Pantsir S-1 units, alongside 4 aircraft hangars at Saky, a combined strike that forced Russian planners to simultaneously worry about their coverage gaps and their aircraft losses in the same 24 hours. On the night of June 25th into June 26th, HUR's unmanned systems department hit Belbek, destroying a MiG-29 in the act of being refueled and a nearby launch support vehicle, a strike precise enough that Ukrainian officials could estimate its cost in the tens of millions of dollars from a single pass. On July 1st, Saky was hit again, 5 hangars this time, 2 of them confirmed holding Su-30 variants at the moment of impact. On July 3rd, Saky absorbed a third strike inside 10 days, 7 hangars hit, housing Su-30SM, Su-30, and Su-24 airframes together, the widest single hit on that base in the sequence. And then, on the night of July 4th into July 5th, the largest single element of the campaign arrived at once, an energy strike large enough to black out the entire occupied peninsula, paired with strikes on Hvardiiske's Shahed storage hangars and surrounding air defense equipment, plus separate strikes on 2 logistics bridges in occupied Donetsk region and ammunition depots spread across 3 different occupied oblasts. Laid out this way, the individual strikes stop looking like 6 unrelated incidents and start looking like a single extended operation broken into stages, each stage removing a capability, a hangar, an aircraft, a defense system, an electrical substation, that the next stage would otherwise have had to fight through. There is also a resource dimension to this campaign that rarely gets the same attention as the footage of hangars burning, but that Ukrainian planners appear to be counting on just as heavily. Every interceptor missile a Pantsir S-1 or an S-400 battery fires at an incoming drone is a missile Russia's defense industry has to replace, produced under sanctions that have measurably constrained access to the electronics and precision components those systems depend on. A single interceptor missile costs a significant multiple of what one of these composite and plywood strike drones costs to build, so even an engagement Russian crews win outright, a drone destroyed before it reaches its target, still represents a lopsided trade in Ukraine's favor if it happens often enough and at large enough scale. Multiply that arithmetic across 400 to 600 drones in a single night, the estimated size of the July 5th wave, and even a defense that intercepts the substantial majority of them, as Russia's claimed figure of 519 drones down that night, would suggest, if accurate, still burns through an enormous quantity of expensive interceptor stock to do it. That is a sustainable posture for exactly as long as Russian industry can keep producing replacement missiles at the rate Ukraine can produce replacement drones, and it is precisely that production race, not any single night's body count, that both sides appear to understand is the real contest underlying the visible strikes on Hvardiiske, Saky, and Belbek. The human dimension of a total blackout across a population of 2.5 million people also deserves to be stated plainly rather than folded into strategic language about dual-use infrastructure. A collapse of the electrical grid across an entire peninsula means water pumping stations lose power, hospitals shift to backup generators with finite fuel, refrigeration and food supply chains are disrupted, and ordinary residents, regardless of how they feel about the occupation, are left without light, heat, or reliable communication for as long as repair crews need to restore service. Mikhail Razvozhayev's public acknowledgement that the outages had killed at least one resident in Sevastopol is a reminder that even a strike campaign aimed squarely at military-relevant infrastructure carries a civilian cost that does not disappear just because the target list is defensible under the laws of armed conflict. Ukrainian officials have been consistent in drawing a distinction between this kind of dual-use infrastructure targeting and Russia's own pattern of strikes against residential buildings, museums, and other purely civilian sites inside Ukraine, a distinction that matters legally and morally, even as both campaigns impose real suffering on people who did not choose the war being fought around them. Looking forward from the first week of July 2026, the pattern established across these strikes suggests a few reasonably confident predictions about what comes next, while leaving the specific timing and targets, as always, uncertain. Russian forces will almost certainly move to repair Hvardiiska's runway and rebuild or relocate its damaged hangars, just as they have after previous strikes on Saky and other Crimean bases throughout the war. They will likely disperse some aircraft and Shahed storage further from the immediate coastline, trading proximity to the front for reduced exposure to exactly this kind of low-altitude drone approach. Air defense reinforcement around the peninsula's remaining key bases is a near certainty, though the same physical limitations, radar horizon against low-flying targets, clutter against small composite airframes, satellite-independent navigation defeating jamming and spoofing, will continue to apply regardless of how many additional batteries Russia moves into position. And Ukraine's unmanned systems forces and HUR have given no public indication that the campaign against Crimea's airfields, bridges, and energy grid is anything other than an ongoing open-ended effort, one more likely to continue at whatever pace Ukrainian production and planning allow than to stop after any single high-profile night of strikes. Whether Hvardiiske, Saky, or a base not yet named in any of this reporting becomes the next site of confirmed strikes and confirmed fires is, as of this writing, still an open question, but the underlying logic of the campaign, sustained, coordinated pressure across airfields, logistics, and the power grid simultaneously, gives little reason to expect that question to stay unanswered for long.